Someone very kindly left a comment on one of my videos suggesting that I should do something on Sappho. Great idea, I thought. Then I realised that the only poem of Sappho I'd ever read was not even really a Sappho poem, but a Latin adaptation, Catullus 51, which is a near word-for-word translation of Sappho fragment 31. Anyway, here's the text of each. Pause if you want your Sappho fix. Sappho is, of course, the most famous lesbian poet, followed at quite some distance by Alcaeus, and I've not even read a single word of his, not even in translation. Sappho is a lyric poet, and lyric poetry is really not my bag. Epic and epic adjacencies where it's at and where it has been at since 800 BC. So as soon as I started to think about Sappho, my mind started wandering back to something I'd read in M.L. West about a pre-literary, lost lesbian epic tradition. So I figured I'd do something on that instead. But as soon as I dusted off my copy of M.L. West's collected papers, I realised it was all way more complex, more contested than I'd recalled. Turns out I'd stumbled upon an epic academic slagging match waged across the pages of the Journal of Hellenic Studies back in the early 90s. Oh my, that's what we like, a right bit of epic contention. Though most of the academic, the linguistic nuances are well above my rudimentarily educated second-rate intellect. But never mind, that's never stopped me before. So with all that said, here's my take on the lost epic poets of Lesbos. Welcome to Ancient Classics. There's long been speculation about a lost lesbian epic tradition, one predating the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, at least in the form in which they have come down to us. But the evidence for a full-blown lesbian epic tradition is tenuous. Broadly, there are two types of evidence, thematic and linguistic. For some context, we need to take a step back and consider the patterns of migration and settlement in the years following the putative date of the Trojan War and the Bronze Age collapse. Now, it is widely held that the island of Lesbos was settled by people from Thessaly. How do we know this? Well, leaving aside clues from the Lesbian dialect, the traditional origin stories of the lesbians were maintained and circulated widely and for long enough throughout the pre-literary era that they were taken for granted in the literary age, and the subsequent literary tradition is littered with references to these Thessalian origins. The ancient written sources are collected by Jean Berard in the annex to a 1959 paper, and I shan't rehearse them here, you can check them out for yourself. Likely these migrations didn't take place all in one go, but it seems there was a significant movement of peoples around the turn of the first millennium BCE, and quite possibly before that too. Here's a timeline, which I'll build out throughout this video. All the dates are very approximate, speculative guesses. Do bear that in mind. Anyway, I said I was going to consider the thematic and linguistic evidence for a lesbian epic tradition. Thematic first. Lesbos is not too far geographically from Troy itself, I guess around 70 kilometers as the crow flies. In my video, Achilles' Origins, I noted, citing chapter 4 of M.L. West's book, The Making of the Iliad, that a large part of the archaic tales about Achilles, which are alluded to by the Iliad and other parts of the epic cycle, seem to be centered around Lesbos. Achilles, according to the text of the Iliad, hails from Phthia in Thessaly, but Thessaly from a distant legendary time, a time at which the ancestors of the lesbians would have lived in Thessaly too. It is therefore not the greatest of leaps to see Achilles as a lesbian folk hero, representative perhaps of their settler ancestors coming from Thessaly and raiding and adventuring around the islands and shorelines local to Lesbos. Many other characters and dynasties from Greek myth, those story cycles that seem particularly suited to heroic epic poetry, seem to have originated from, or at least have had a preoccupation with, Thessaly. Jason of the Argonauts fame and his evil uncle Peleus come apparently from Iolcus in Thessaly, so the density of myths ostensibly focusing around these characters from Thessaly has given rise to speculation that there may have existed a Thessalian epic tradition, one inherited and kept alive perhaps by their colonial offshoots in Lesbos or wherever via a strand of their own heroic poetry. So much for the thematic connections between the extant archaic epic tradition and the folks of Lesbos and their Thessalian ancestors. I mentioned earlier that the other pieces of evidence pointing to an Aeolic / lesbian influence on epic is linguistic. Some more context. Recall that Lesbos was settled by people from Thessaly around the turn of the first millennium BCE. We've speculated that those original settlers might have brought stories of Thessalian heroes with them. That's speculation. But it seems more or less certain that the Thessalian settlers did bring with them their own dialect of Greek, the Aeolic dialect as it's known, a version of which their lesbian descendants would continue to speak for many centuries. Indeed, if we are to refer to the extant archaic lesbian poetry, that of Sappho and Alcaeus, it is written in that dialect. Now, conversely, if Lesbos was traditionally said to have been settled by colonists from Thessaly, then Ionia was said to have been settled by colonists from Athens, Euboea or Evia, and thereabouts. And therefore, the Ionic, as typified by, for example, the prose of Herodotus, who came from Halicarnassus, is somewhat different from the Attic dialect, in which Athenians such as Plato and Xenophon wrote, but far more like that Attic / Athenian dialect than the lesbian Aeolic dialect of Sappho and Alcaeus. But I'm referring to the Ionic prose of Herodotus, and the focus of this video is not on prose, but on poetry, and more specifically, epic poetry. Now, it is usually said that Greek heroic epic evolved or reached its near maturity in Ionia. This belief is coded into the, albeit fictional, conflicting and belated ancient biographies of Homer, which generally claim that Homer came from Ionia, whether Smyrna, as the author of the pseudo-Herodotean Life of Homer would have it, Chios or elsewhere. And the Ionian affiliations of epic are embedded in the dialect in which the Iliad and the Odyssey, and indeed the surviving fragments of the epic cycle, are themselves written. The dialect in which these epics were written is predominantly Ionian-based, but it's certainly nothing like the prose of, for example, Herodotus. Rather, it is an artificial, archaicizing form of language, a Kunstsprach, which I need to be very careful how I pronounce, comprising elements of many traditions and locales. And so, contained within that albeit predominantly Ionian-based dialect of Homer and cyclic epic is more than a whiff of the Aeolic dialect, and specifically, according to some like M.L. West, an Aeolic dialect of the lesbian kind. The presence of Aeolic influences in the epic dialect doesn't really seem to be disputed. From what I've read, it's almost taken for granted. The only controversy is what to make of these features, these Aeolic or lesbian intrusions in the language of epic. Let's take a look at some of the controversial theories put forward by M.L. West in a series of papers in the 1980s and early 90s about the possible existence of a lesbian epic tradition and its formative role in the development of the Homeric epics. But it seems to me that M.L. West first started thinking seriously about the differences and relationships between Ionian and Aeolic or lesbian poetic styles in a paper published in the 1970s called Greek Poetry 2000 to 700 BC, in which he posited the development of three very different styles in the Dark Ages: the Ionian, the Aeolic, and the Doric being from the Peloponnese. In that paper, however, West distinguished very much between Ionian epic and Aeolic lyric forms. He hadn't yet integrated the concept of Aeolic epic into this theory. Maybe I'll cover all that another time, in which case I'll link the future video here. Now, West's thinking seems to have evolved through the 1970s and 80s, until 1988, when he wrote a paper called The Rise of Greek Epic, which was published in the Journal of Hellenic Studies. By this stage, West had begun to see the Aeolic and Ionian epic traditions not so much as different, perhaps contemporaneous and coexisting strands, developing an isolated parallel from each other, but rather he posited that the mainstream epic tradition had somehow evolved out of the Aeolic or lesbian tradition, or at least had gone through a formative Aeolic lesbian phase, before finally evolving into its predominantly Ionian form. See, according to what is probably the most commonly held model, the mainstream epic tradition evolved in Mycenaean times, possibly in the Peloponnese around Pylos, and then was transmitted to Ionia, possibly via Attica, where it evolved to maturity, picking up Aeolic or Lesbian influences along the way. But West challenged that view, claiming that the epic tradition went through a full Aeolic phase, stating that a simple linear development from Mycenaean to Ionian epic is absolutely excluded by certain fundamental features of the Homeric language. So, if I'm to recap or simplify the argument put forward by West in the rise of Greek epic, one could say that the epic tradition, which originated in Indo-European heroic poetic traditions, evolved in Greece, possibly in and around the Peloponnese, say Pylos, throughout the second millennium BCE. So much so that by, say, 1400 BCE, it may have been recited in the now familiar hexameter verse. Then somewhere along the line, the tradition went through a Aeolic lesbian phase. Perhaps the tradition, i.e. the main poets and practitioners, migrated from the Peloponnese to Thessaly, and their descendants from Thessaly to Lesbos. Or perhaps the tradition, the poets, migrated possibly via Athens to Ionia first, and then moved over to Lesbos for a few generations before moving back to Ionia. Although I'm already falling into the trap, which West subsequently disputed, of thinking a little bit too literally about the epic tradition moving around with actual movements of poets, as opposed to a more nebulous kind of movement of cultural influences, not necessarily involving the actual physical transfer of practitioners. Oh, you can tell I'm totally bullshitting at this stage, but never mind. But whatever form this transmission took, it would have occurred, if indeed it did occur, sometime between the 14th century and the 8th century BCE. See, the epic genre then matured some more in Ionia, and possibly then relocating back to West Ionia, i.e. Athens, or more likely Euboea or Evia, which, as I explained in my videos on the Lelantine War, was the epicenter for Greek culture and commerce in the 8th century and just before. Perhaps. I've totally fudged that summary, but who cares? Well, everyone cares, because the whole concept of an Aeolic or lesbian phase of epic poetry became pretty contentious. West's paper, The Rise of Greek Epic, which put forward this view of a distinct Aeolic phase in the development of the epic tradition, was published in 1988. But then in 1990, Professor John Chadwick, the Chadwick, the one who along with Michael Ventris was so instrumental in decoding Linear B, Chadwick responded to West's Rise of the Greek Epic with a paper published also in the Journal of Hellenic Studies named, perhaps sarcastically, The Descent of Greek Epic. Opening with the words, "Readers of M.L. West's article may have been left with the impression that we know a great deal about the pre-Homeric stages of the epic tradition. It appears to me that much of what West wrote is based on questionable assumptions, which are all the more dangerous for not being explicitly stated." Oh my, you can tell from that Chadwick's paper would not be the end of it. Chadwick, moreover, refused to accept that the Aeolic elements in epic, whose existence he did not dispute, were remnants of an Aeolic phase in the tradition, referring to the much-cited traditional view that the language of Homer, of epic, is a Kunstsprach, that word again, an artificial idiom constructed out of archaic dialectical and invented forms, used both for their metrical utility and to give the effect of distancing the poetic language from everyday speech. Then a couple of years later, also in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, William Wyatt piled in too in a paper called Homer's Linguistic Forebears. He began his paper with a somewhat more conciliatory tone than Chadwick, calling West's Rise of the Greek Epic a magisterial account of the history of Greek epic in which Aeolic phases are assumed. But then he too let rip, stating that if after examining the data one is minded to identify certain elements as Aeolic, One would not thereby conclude that the forms in question derive from an Aeolic epic or tradition of epic poetry that is otherwise unattested. Such a conclusion seems premature, if not preposterous, and if one does assume an Aeolic phase of epic composition, one is, it seems to me, obliged to provide an accounting for all the linguistic aspects of the supposed Aeolic epic. That is to say, most hypotheses of an Aeolic phase of epic composition are so vague and imprecise. Rather, the view favoured by Wyatt was that the Aeolic influences in the text of Homer, of which acknowledges there are many, are relatively late additions to the language of epic, which is primarily derived from an Ionian tradition. Wyatt couldn't really imagine how a distinct epic tradition grew up in Lesbos and then somehow translated itself wholesale into Ionia, and how, if it did, Wyatt then transformed into something more Ionian. All in all, Wyatt thought that the Aeolic poetic traditions, epic or otherwise, were grafted onto the Ionian tradition at a later date, but that fundamentally the epic tradition derived from Mycenaean times and then went through a several hundred-year period of development in Ionia. Then, borrowing Aeolic influences along the way, spread across Greece in its late stage. So why then would the Ionian poets have taken on board such Aeolic or lesbian stylings? Surely there must have been more of a reason than just making the epic sound somehow distinct from everyday speech. Well, one of the reasons might have been thematic. Remember how I mentioned that lesbian locations and themes seem to play an important role in the part of the Iliad, and indeed Lesbos is relatively closely located to Troy itself. Well, maybe that prompted the artificial adoption of lesbian or Aeolic stylings, rather than being naturally inherited. I guess a parallel would be how often in US high medieval fantasy TV dramas and films, American actors sometimes put on a fake English accent. Think Peter Dinklage's Tyrion Lannister in the Game of Thrones, because medieval fantasy is kind of associated with medieval Europe, and Europe in an Anglophone setting basically means England, So somehow it's seen as appropriate to the fantasy genre that a fantasy knight or lord should speak in something approximating English received pronunciation, whereas, for example, a fantasy villager should speak in something approaching a more rural UK English accent. Not a perfect parallel, of course, because Homeric language doesn't somehow make some characters speak more Aeolic than others, rather the influences are scattered throughout the epic as a whole. Or indeed, perhaps the Aeolic terms just fit the meter better in particular situations. So yeah, if a particular Aeolic dialect term just happened to fit the flow better, why not use it? All these random, internally inconsistent elements also tie in with Chadwick's reference to the language of epic being a Kunstsprach. The usage of certain words doesn't have to have any kind of deep, authentic meaning. It doesn't need to evidence some lost source or linguistic archaeological layer. It might just have sounded epic. Anyway, M.L. West wasn't going to take all this without a riposte, so he doubled down with his paper, The Descent of Greek Epic, a Reply, in which he responded to both Chadwick and Wyatt, dismissing them both. His response to Chadwick was limited to discussion on linguistic features, calling many of Chadwick's points mere matters of spelling or orthography, and West dismissed Wyatt's inference that he, West that is, was viewing the changing phases of epic traditions as being tied into the migration of specific poets. He trashed Wyatt's view that epic poets artificially brought in Aeolic influences for thematic and stylistic reasons, noting that this is to attribute to the bards a measure of linguistic self-consciousness and artifice worthy of the Alexandrians. Reference to Lesbos in the context of the Trojan War, West concluded, and interests in Troy itself are not merely contingent phenomena that encouraged an Ionian epic tradition to sprout a few Aeolicisms. They themselves point to a prior Aeolic epic, and the linguistic Aeolicisms point with them. Why fight it? Well, me and my ignorance, I really don't know what to make of this all. I think most scholars agree that there are linguistic traces of Aeolicisms, i.e. the lesbian dialect, in the epics of Homer, and for sure there are references in Homer to Thessalian concerns, and likely there indeed were a whole bunch of epics featuring heroes from Thessaly. And yeah, Achilles and his extra-Iliadic adventures might represent a strand with associations particularly meaningful to the descendants of the original Thessalian settlers of Lesbos. But can anyone be more specific than that? Can we really say that there was a lost tradition of lesbian epic poets who at some point dominated the epic genre and left a permanent mark on the developing mainstream tradition? Or was it just the case that the epic tradition, reaching near maturity in Ionia, naturally absorbed poetic themes and linguistic features from the nearby lesbians, with whom the Ionian poets presumably came into frequent contact? So yeah, it's nice to speculate and funny to look back on scholars slagging matches, but who knows? But with all that said, I've omitted to mention one guy, one genuine lesbian epic poet, Lesches of Mytilene or Pyrrha, fragments of whose work does actually survive, if that is we can trust the attribution of an epic to him. See, this Lesches guy is by repute the author of one of the key cyclic epics, the Little Iliad, or Parva Ilias to give it its Latin name. From various ancient summaries and the like, and scattered quotations, we're told that the Little Iliad was apparently set during the Trojan War in the period between the death of Achilles through to the actual sack of Troy proper. It was jam-packed with many famous incidents from the Trojan War, like the dispute between Odysseus and Ajax over the armor of Achilles, and the insulted Ajax's subsequent madness and self-deletion. Apparently one can't say that word on YouTube. It's also the epic in which Odysseus famously disguises himself as a beggar, infiltrates Troy, and meets Helen. It's also reported to have included the construction of the Trojan horse and possibly the sack of Troy itself, though much of those incidents were also the theme of the Perses, the sack of Troy, another poem in the epic cycle. Now, only a few fragments of Lesches' Little Iliad remain, quoted in various sources. The opening 2 lines of the poem go, "I sing of Troy and Dardania good for horses, around which the Danaans, the ministers of Ares, suffered many things." Now this is a classic epic opening, albeit it doesn't directly invoke the muse, and it's written in dactylic hexameters in the Ionian-based dialect, i.e. it is in much the same linguistic style as Homer, or whatever have you. So to be clear, even if we take it for granted that this is written by Lesches of Lesbos, it is not an example of any purported Aeolic epic style of the kind posited by West. Rather, it is fully mainstream epic. Because you see, at some point the epic tradition that had reached its near maturity in Ionia entered into a near final pan-Hellenic phase. It spread from the regions of Ionia across the entire Greek-speaking world, eventually forming the foundation of all Greek culture. Quite when this happened is unknown. M.L. West posits that it might have occurred in or around the 8th century, citing as evidence a sudden re-emergence in interest in what by then would have been ancient Bronze Age burial sites and stuff. And the Ionian turned pan-Hellenic form of epic would, it seems, either have supplanted localized epic poetic styles or filled the gap left by long dead or dormant heroic epic traditions. So that would explain why a few hundred years later the lesbian epic poet Lesches, if indeed he was actually the author of the Little Iliad, would write an epic that, from its surviving fragments, would appear to be in much the same style as the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so now we come back to Sappho. You didn't think I'd forgotten her, did you? Sappho was presumably aware of the epic tradition. She was active probably in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, and by her time perhaps all traces of any lesbian-specific epic form, if ever there was one, had been supplanted by this now mainstream pan-Hellenic post-Ionic style, that which perhaps a couple of generations would produce the like of Lesches. Sappho was by no stretch of the imagination an epic poet, but one of her surviving albeit fragmentary works is most definitely epic adjacent. I'm referring to fragment 44 from a papyrus found at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, number 1232 as it is conventionally titled. I'll refer to the edition used in David Campbell's Lerb and mostly his translation too. Cyprus. The herald came. Adias. Swift messenger. Rest of Asia. Undying glory. Hector and his companions brought lively-eyed, beautiful Andromache from holy Thebes and Plachaea in their ships over the salt sea, and many golden bracelets and purple-hued robes and ornate trinkets, and countless silver cups and ivories. So he spoke, and nimbly did his father leap up, and word spread about the spacious city to his friends. At once the Iliades yoked the mules to the well-wheeled chariot, and the whole crowd of women embarked along with the maidens. Apart, the daughters of Priam and the unwed men yoked the horses to the chariots, greatly charioteers, like gods, holy, set out to Troy. The reed pipe and lyre joined in with the sound of percussion, and the maidens sang clearly their sacred song, and the wondrous, resonant sound reached the stars and all around the streets. Bowls and cups, myrrh and cassia and frankincense were mingled. The older women cried out and the men cried out, invoking Paean, a hymn for god-like Hector and Andromache. So, Sappho's fragment 44 is about the preparations and ceremonies of the marriage of Hector and Andromache. It's not written in the hexameter meter of Ionian epic, but it's clearly inspired by the themes of the Trojan War. It uses language and phraseology that, if not directly lifted from the extant epics of Homer, seems to be quite influenced by them. That theme, the wedding rites of Hector and Andromache, is a powerful one. The wedding scene of characters from or associated with epic tradition has an important place in the classical literary tradition in general. Take, for example, Catullus' famous 64th poem, which is an Epyllion set at the wedding of Achilles' parents, Peleus and Thetis. But Peleus and Thetis' relationship was, you could say, problematic, as indeed is the relationship between most couples in the epic tradition, even, in fact, especially Odysseus and Penelope. But Andromache and Hector, the bride and groom in Sappho's poem, well, they're an exception. Theirs is a beautiful and true love. I'd go as far as saying that they're perhaps the only positively presented couple in Homeric epic and its offshoots. The most striking depiction in Homer of this loving couple's relationship is perhaps the famous scene in Book 6 of the Iliad, where Hector goes to find Andromache on the walls. She is with their infant son, Astyanax, and his nurse. Astyanax is scared by his father, who, when he appears, is still wearing his helmet. The scene is touching. If anything, it would risk being a little too cute, were it not for the fact that it's overshadowed by impending doom. Within a few days, we, the audience, know that Hector will be dead, and albeit outside the narrative scope of the Iliad itself, Troy will be sacked, baby Astyanax will be thrown from the walls of Troy, and Andromache will be taken into slavery, with all that entails. The characters' fates lie heavily over that domestic scene in the Iliad, and the characters almost seem conscious of their own fates. So, even in Homer, the love between Hector and Andromache is in some respects the most perfect and pure, but also, given what follows, one of the most tragic unions in classical or any literature. Now, several scholars and commentators, including Lawrence Schrenk, have drawn parallels between Sappho's depiction of Andromache and Hector's wedding celebrations in Fragment 44, and a scene featuring both Andromache and kind of Hector in the Iliad, but not the scene in Book 6 of the Iliad in which we see the loving couple together with their infant son upon the walls of Troy. No, rather the closest parallel to Sappho's scene of the new bride Andromache being brought to Troy in a chariot is the scene in Iliad 24 in which the corpse of Hector is brought to Troy in a wagon. In Schrenk's words, through Homeric reminiscences, Sappho indissolubly links the marriage and the death of Hector. The Homeric scene, like the remnants of Fragment 44, is very brief. And hey, it's Homer, so I'm going to read it out for you. But first, the narrative context. Hector's killed in battle by Achilles. Achilles defiles Hector's body and takes it back to his camp. King Priam, Hector's father, infiltrates the Greek camp and begs Achilles face to face to release his son's corpse. Achilles grants Priam's request. Priam, at this point, is now returning to Troy, bringing back his son's corpse in a mule-drawn wagon. The passage begins with an announcement by Hector's sister, Cassandra. Cassandra wailed and then screamed throughout the entire city. Men and women of Troy, come and see for yourself Hector. If ever you rejoice to see him returning home alive from battle, then he was a great joy to the city and all its folks. So she spoke, and then no man or woman remained where they were in the city. For overwhelming grief had come upon them all, and they gathered together by the gates, receiving Priam as he brought the corpse. First, Hector's dear wife Andromache and his mother the queen tore their hair in grief, threw themselves upon the well-wheeled wagon, desperately clinging to Hector's head. The crowd, weeping, stood around. Now for the entire day until sunset would they have wept before the gates, shedding tears for Hector, had not old man Priam addressed the people from the wagon. "Let me and the mules pass. You may have your fill of grief once I have brought Hector home." So he spoke, and they stood aside and let the wagon pass. And they led Hector's corpse to the renowned palace. Then they placed him upon a slatted couch. They appointed bards to stand beside him, singing a lament. Bards who sang a mournful song, a threnody, and with them the women mourned. Schrenk calls out the structural similarities, the analogues between this Homeric passage and Sappho fragment 44. Both passages begin with an announcement, voiced by Cassandra in Homer, by Aeneas in Sappho. In both passages, a wagon or chariot brings the corpse, or bride, as the case may be. In each case, the vehicle is described using the same epic epithet, euthrokos, well-wheeled or something like that. The corpse, or bride, is accompanied by one of the Trojan royals, Priam or Hector, and received by others, accompanied by the Trojan populace. Then follows ritual songs of lament or celebration. Nonetheless, Schrenk and others draw out many other cross-references, allusions, or ironizing reflections by Sappho from the Homeric text. Not just the scene in which Hector's body is brought to Troy, but other passages dealing with the direct consequences of his death. For example, Sappho, in her passage, describes wondrous goods, many golden bracelets and purple-hued robes, and ornate trinkets, and countless silver cups and ivories. Andromache's dowry, no doubt. Schrenk notes that the ransom brought by Priam to Achilles for the return of Hector's body comprises similar items. Could Sappho be suggesting that Andromache's dowry was used to procure the return of her husband's corpse? Even if we are to take the view that Sappho fragment 44 is a direct response to the account of the return of Hector's corpse to Troy, well, what does that actually mean? Well, what would that actually have meant in terms of poetic practice? Would Sappho have sat down with a copy of the Iliad and then draw inspiration from it, adapting her own lyrics therefrom? Well, if so, that would presuppose that Sappho actually had a text, much as we have it today, and that she directly referred to it when writing her lyrics. But that feels a little anachronistic. Sappho is usually held to have been active in the late 7th, early 6th century, when Greek writing was still something of a novelty. It's not clear whether she wrote her poetry as part of the compositional process, or whether it was only later taken down, whether by Sappho herself or by a scribe. And if it were taken down by a scribe, it's not clear whether it was dictated by Sappho herself or by someone else, whether during or after Sappho's lifetime. Nor can we be sure that the Iliad had been reduced to writing by the time that Sappho was composing, and if it had, in what kind of form. Indeed, one of the traditional accounts was that the Iliad was not put into written form until the time of Pisistratus, a century or so after Sappho. And even then, long after the Homeric poems were put into writing, there existed multiple variants of the texts, and it wasn't until the efforts of the Alexandrian librarians, and even later still, that the Homeric poems reached something approximating a standardized universal form. So this Sapphic fragment calls us to reflect on wider considerations, the nature of allusion to and citation from other works in a pre-literary or semi-literary era. Perhaps when Sappho composed the poem, she did not have any particular version of the Iliad in front of her to use as a source, one to carefully or consciously adapt and subvert to her own ends. Perhaps she was instead inspired by a performance she had heard once, just as one might watch a movie, go back home and write something inspired off the back of it. Or perhaps her work was a response to a looser congregation of tropes and themes, not specific to any particular work or performance, but reflective of the kind of poems that were doing the rounds. Whatever one thinks about Sappho's interaction with the epic tradition, it's difficult not to consider this fragment as being some kind of response to, and a direct response to, or a reflection or refraction of the epic tradition. And me personally, I found that once I'd been made aware of the parallels between the funeral procession of Hector and the bridal procession of Andromache, I found it very difficult to disentangle the two in my mind. So I've started and ended with Sappho, ring composition. This video's over. Shout out to Michael Walton for the original artwork. Like and subscribe and we'll be back soon.